continent of Africa is on the brink of a significant awakening, and the European countries, especially France, is gripped with fears. The message is loud and clear. Some people say Africans don't like France, and they want nothing to do with the European nation. Just like what is happening in Niger, where thousands of protesters gathered outside a French military base in Niamey on Friday to demand the withdrawal of France from the Sahel region. Outside the French embassy in Kinshasa, protesters chanted "Macron assassin" or "Macron get out" days after a military coup in Niger. For the past few years, citizens in various Western African countries have started to publicly oppose French interference. The unrest has been rising month over month, to the point where now French embassies are being destroyed, and African presidents are scolding France at presidential summits. But one would ask, why the animosity, and why towards France and not other countries? How did the relationship between France and its former allies get so bad? Is natural resources such as uranium the major problem? Or is there more hidden secrety about this that we don't know? Well, the answer lies in the history of West Africa regions, which many do not know about. From late 19th century, some part of West African regions was colonized by France. Then, after the Second World War, most of these regions gained their independence, but unlike other colonizers like Great Britain, France never left. Their influence and presence continued to linger. But the big question is, why didn't France leave? Well, to understand this, we need to travel back in time to the 16th century. This was the time when France became interested in Africa. During this time, their main reason was slave trade. Yes, France were the third biggest slave traders. According to statistics, they took about 1.3 million Africans to their colonies in the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. So, as the slave trade developed, France needed ports. They built one in 1659 here in St. Louis in Senegal. For a very long time, French interests were limited to coastal African regions, but in the early 19th century that changed. There were two reasons for that. The first reason was because of the domestic rivalry that European powers had back home. They were already competing with each other over who would take the larger part of Africa regions. The second reason was resources. Europe needed to feed its expanding industries, and Africa, being a region with so much resources, was the best option for them. Therefore, France focused her force on this part of African region called the Gold Coast. In 1854, General Louis Faidherbe was appointed governor. He quickly got down to business. Under his rule, French control was extended from Senegal to Gambia. But his ambitions were bigger. He wanted to conquer the Niger Delta and Mali. His government was not so keen. They thought it would be too expensive, so the expansion project was paused. It would resume in the 1880s. This time was the beginning of the Scramble for Africa. For those who do not know what Scramble for Africa means, it is the name given to the way in which European countries brought nearly all of the African continent under their control as part of their separate empires. Are you deriving value from this video so far? If yes, please support us so we can make more informative videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving this video a like. Okay, let's continue. During this time, European armies were marching across the African continent. They were picking off countries one by one, incorporating them under their rules. This inevitably led to fighting between European powers. So a German chancellor by the name Otto von Bismarck proposed a plan. He brought all the European countries together in Berlin in 1885. Here, the European countries signed what is known as the Berlin Act, which formalized the Scramble for Africa. The logic was quite simple. Instead of fighting each other, let's divide and share the continent. Each country gets its own colony, and all this was done without consulting a single African individual or their local chiefs. But before this time, almost 95% of the African continent was ruled by the local kings, sultans, and tribal chiefs. But by 1900, everything changed, and about 90% of African region was colonized by Europe, and Niger was part of this. In 1899, 2 French officers were put on the job. Captain Paul Voulet would lead this mission, and the second in command was Julien Chanoine. Both men had one thing in common: their bloodlust. They set off from Dakar in Senegal. Their job was this: explore Chad and Niger, gather local intelligence, reach the Sudan, and return. Basically, create this ribbon of French territory from Senegal in the west to the Sudan in the east. French troops marched through the Sahara and secured the region. Their African project was complete. It looked like this: a federation of 8 territories: Mauritania, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Benin, and Niger. The capital was Dakar. This whole region was called French West Africa. French rule was characterized by sharp contradictions between a rhetorical commitment to the civilization of indigenous people through cultural, political, and economic reform, and the harsh realities of violent conquest, economic exploitation, legal inequality, and social geocultural disruption. Throughout French Africa, the colonized people developed strategies to resist or evade French authority and challenge the notion of civilizing mission. After the First World War, a new wave of organized contestation emerged as Western-educated reformers, nationalists, and trade unions fought for a fairer distribution of political and administrative power. These demands for change eventually led to the decolonization of many African nations, but this marked the beginning of a problematic relationship with France. Unlike other colonizing nations, such as Britain and Germany, France did not fully disengage from its former colonies. Instead, it maintained complex ties with them, including military presence, economic influence, and close access to heads of state. This web of relationships, known as France-Afrique, symbolized France's obsession with retaining a foothold in its former colonies and has been a significant source of discontent in Africa. France, having exploited energy resources and mines in its colonies, was reluctant to let go of privileged access to these resources. Africa's wealth was no secret, and France sought to maintain its economic advantage. Additionally, France viewed sub-Saharan Africa as an extension of itself and wanted to protect its image as a global power. French military bases were established throughout the region to guard against both Soviet and American influence. Despite gaining independence, African nations found themselves financially supporting France, almost as a form of tribute. For example, there have been reports of French presidents receiving funds from African heads of state, which were then used to manipulate African leaders and finance political campaigns in France. This unequal dynamic has perpetuated a sense of control and dependency. One might ask why African nations agreed to these terms. For many newly independent nations, France offered protection from internal and external threats, such as coups and rebel groups. In exchange, these countries granted France preferential access to their resources. However, this arrangement often resulted in authoritarian rule and economic exploitation, leading to mounting tensions between France and its former colonies. Recent events have escalated existing tensions. The French military's operations in the Sahel region, aimed at combating extremist groups, have faced criticism for their effectiveness and the civilian casualties they have caused. Many Africans perceive these actions as a continuation of French interventionism and a reminder of colonial-era attitudes. Economic grievances have also been a major concern. African nations have long decried the imbalanced terms of their economic relationships with France, arguing that French corporations benefit disproportionately and that trade agreements favor France. The use of the CFA franc, a currency pegged to the euro, and backed by the French treasury, has further diminished African economic sovereignty and fueled calls for more control over domestic economies. Moreover, there is a growing sense of African nationalism and the desire for self-determination. Many Africans feel that France's continued influence infringes upon their sovereignty, and they believe it is time for Africa to determine its own future without external interference. As a result, protests, demands for economic reform, and calls for the withdrawal of French military forces have become widespread in various African countries, including Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. This wave of anti-French sentiment reflects a powerful sentiment across the continent that seeks to redefine the relationship between African nations and France.